Hello, welcome back. This is the third part of the video then about South Africa between 1910 and 1948. Having a look really now at the groups, the different groups within South Africa and how they're responding to the development of legislation by the white government in order to secure white political, social, cultural and economic dominance over South Africa. We've already seen how the two governments, the Botha government, then Smuts, and then the National Party government of Hertzog are building up legislation to try and control land, the economy, and the movement of people. The response comes from the different communities within South Africa in a variety of different ways. The Indian response begins led by Gandhi. He's been in Natal since the mid-1890s and he works with a group of people to organise a number of protests. He does have some success. The 1907 protests against the pass laws kind of end with a little vagueness, but that emerging idea of passive, peaceful, non-violent resistance is something that also is very important to Gandhi. He's developing those formulas that he'll take successfully to India as well a little bit later on. He does have some success also in 1913. He returns to India in 1914, and the South African Indian Congress, founded in 1923, will carry on the work that he does there. So that's the beginning of the Indian response. Most Indians are in Natal. They're descended mostly from, they're free descendants of indentured labourers that had come over to work on the Natal sugar plantations. But remember, there is a community of Indians that had settled freely in South Africa over the late 18th, late 18th, 19th centuries, who had become as traders and lawyers and professionals like Gandhi himself. Most of the Indians living in South Africa are Hindus, but there's a significant class of Muslim merchants, and some of those people are quite wealthy. The next group of people to have a look at and consider, again, another smaller group compared to the African response, which is what I'm going to have a look at finally, is a diverse group of people living mostly in the Cape Province. Many of them are particularly poor. They're working as labourers on the farms there, on the wine growing as well, and many of them are illiterate. Most coloureds worked on farms or urban menial jobs, and they're represented by the African People's Organisation that's set up in 1905, and you can see their leader there, Dr. Abdullah Abdul Rahman, who's a pretty charismatic figure and really takes the APO further on. One of the challenges, however, is that most of their business in the early years of their foundations was making sure that they protected the limited rights that coloureds had in Cape provinces, which had been threatened with the Union in 1910. You've got a couple of different perspectives there. Richard van der Ross is quoted in Pretorius's anthology, A History of South Africa, and Beck there again. So some different ideas about the type of response that coloureds were putting forward to the attempts at white legal supremacy. In terms of the African response, though, this is probably the most well developed, as you would expect, with a much larger population of Africans, many of them living in rural areas, but migration to urban areas in search of employment is increasing urban pressure and also increasing opportunities for people to come into contact with each other to develop the thinking. From 1909 onwards, there had been African newspapers being published. An African delegation had travelled to London in 1909 to protest about the racist provisions of the South Africa Act and the Union itself, and had received little support from anyone in London. In 1912, the South African Native National Congress is formed, the SANNC, and it will later change its name to the African National Congress, the ANC. Many of its founders had been educated at mission schools, and some had travelled to Europe and the USA for an education, and there's also a South African native college founded in the Eastern Cape. The first president of the ANC, John Dubert, has been educated in the USA, and he's very heavily influenced by the ideas of Booker T. Washington, that individual advancement can come through education. The ANC calls for the removal of the colour bar, increasing African representations, but it also encourages African groups to help each other out and to end tribalism and tribal feuds. Beck notes that the delegates of the ANC were products of a Western education and believed that white South African Christians would respond humanely to their attempts to bring about change. However, as you saw in the previous video, white South African Christianity, that breakaway now from the Dutch Reformed Church, is beginning to actually help support and develop Afrikaner nationalism. So there's really no joy in terms of pursuing that angle. There are a series of protests, peaceful petitioning, as well as more violent, not as more violent, excuse me, but kind of more active elements like striking. But the ANC begins to stop sanctioning that violent activity after the 1919 miners' strike goes brutally wrong there for them. They do have some successes again with passport protests, as also did have Gandhi with the Indian community. So there's a couple of things that are working in their favour. World War I itself challenges the response of different communities in South Africa to white rule. But certainly ideas of self-determination being pushed out by Woodrow Wilson, ideas of the rights of free people, were appealing to all of the communities of South Africa, and raised hopes that at the end of the war, Britain would install in Africans their rightful place in a democratic South Africa. However, that doesn't happen. No African delegates are allowed to represent South Africa at the Versailles Peace Conferences. By the 1920s and 1930s, the APO, the SAIC and the ANC, together with some white liberals, are forming joint councils. They're setting up institutions and organisations to talk across the board. In 1935, the All-African Convention, the AAC, meets to protest the Natives Trust and Land Act, as well as some of the Representative of Natives Bill proposals. They're trying to work within the political framework rather than boycott it. Protest so far, particularly strike action, has led to brutal repression, so the idea of petitioning, active, non-violent resistance is what's gaining ground at the moment. There are some white South African representatives who are trying to protest the moves by the Hertzog government, but there's plenty of support for Hertzog, and the white protests either don't really get very far. There's a couple of big trade unions. The ICU is probably the biggest at this time. It has a large membership across the 1920s, but fades fairly quickly. The Communist Party of South Africa will become another key player in the anti-apartheid movement later, but at this time its role is a little bit more hazy. It's directly controlled from Moscow, which causes tensions really in relation to how democracy would work in a communist South Africa in terms of participation of the different groups. But also the communists are pretty influential in some of the other organisations that are being set up at this time. So they will go on to have an increasing influence and will be consistently anti-apartheid. And they take members, of course, from every single group of people across South Africa. So they are one of the few environments where coloureds, Africans, whites, Indians will be getting together to discuss political ideas. World War II has a huge impact on South Africa. One of the key aspects is the shift in domestic policy. There's a split now. The United Party's coalition is over. Smuts wants to side with Britain. He sees Hitler wanting to dominate the world and that the destiny of mankind is on the line. Hertzog prefers neutrality. He believes the war would be a disaster for South Africa. Hertzog resigns as the Prime Minister. Smuts replaces him and takes South Africa to war as a British ally. And he does that with the support of the South African Parliament, by the way. South African troops fight across southern, eastern and northern Africa. So they are busy there in terms of supporting the British war effort. And that's another important note for us. Again, hoping perhaps that contribution will lead to increased autonomy for South Africa in the future. South Africa will benefit economically from the war as well, with those key minerals proving a high value product. Within South Africa, though, nationalist Afrikaners are generally opposed to the support of Britain, and for some extremists there's a appeal of Nazism, perhaps ideas about the master race and anti-Semitism is continuing. There's a disappointment excuse me, that South Africa has allied to the heathen Soviet Union, and in 1942 some pro-Nazi groups carry out sabotage and random violence. Post offices, railways, as well as some soldiers and some Jews in South Africa are attacked. Guillaume points out in the Pretorius book, A History of South Africa, however, that these extremist groups aren't really taken very seriously. They're often ridiculed for their kind of fake military ranks and sort of martinet style drills. And by 1943, and certainly the end of 1943, the enthusiasm and support dries up really as it's increasingly clear that the Allies will prevail in the Second World War. In the meantime, the Atlantic Charter has been published by Churchill and Roosevelt in 1941, setting the scene for the development of the United Nations, as well as emphasizing human rights and self-determination. It appeals to all of the groups that are protesting white rule in South Africa, and also inspires 3 young African professionals, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, to found a youth league within the ANC. And this youth league is also encouraged by worldwide anti-colonial movements, including Gandhi's. So politically, with Hertzog's resignation, the National Party has had to reconfigure. They now unite with Malan's PNP under Hertzog's league. But Hertzog dies in 1942 and is replaced by Malan as their leader. The 1943 wartime election is particularly encouraging for the National Party, who achieve half the seats of Smuts's United Party. And there are still continuing problems, hardly surprisingly, for South Africans. The demands of the war economy have not made life better, and in fact, workers' wages remain below the poverty line, poor education for South African blacks, and more than ever, Africans are moving into the townships. And this increasing urbanization of Africans will perhaps prove one of the challenges, and historians will debate this, that will increase the likelihood of National Party success in the elections after World War II. Black trade union membership is also increasing, but Smuts will be out there again using the army to crush strikes in 1946. So there's lots of activity still from groups opposed to white rule, but in the same time there's some encouragement for the Afrikaner nationalists. The 1948 election runs in an environment of pretty high white anxiety. As often during a war, low-paid workers get more power as they're producing goods for the government. Smuts is now a major world figure. He's drafting the preamble of the United Nations Charter, promising fundamental human rights in the UN Charter, none of which he guarantees to the vast majority of people in South Africa. He's beginning to be perceived perhaps as an old man, as someone who's out of touch. One of the challenges in the United Nations in its early years will come from India, when they'll challenge the South African legislation that's been introduced to restrict Indian rights within South Africa. India boycotts South Africa economically and opposes South Africa's request to the United Nations to incorporate Southwest Africa into South Africa proper. Remember, German Southwest Africa had been mandated to South Africa at the end of the First World War. Urbanization of coloureds, Africans and Indians is concerning the white community, growth of shanty towns, and white workers are fearing competition. Malan is on the rise in South Africa, supported by different Afrikaner groups, including the church, and their segregational policy is clear as opposed to Smuts's less clear United Party policy. Indians are declared to be permanent aliens. Africans will be temporary visitors to white areas and should be restricted to the reserves. Quotas on African migration to towns. But there's a contradiction at the heart of National Party policy at this time. In the 1948 elections, Smuts is poorly prepared, tired and out of touch. And with that balance on rural areas, the National Party, even though it receives less votes, actually wins the election. Historians disagree about the impact of the race issues. Guillaume talks about it's the war declaration that actually puts the sort of deal, seals the deal for Smuts and kind of finishes him off, and it's the National Party that takes advantage of the turmoil of the war. But Cher, also in the same book by Pretorius, talks about Malan's racial strategy. So there's another opportunity for you to introduce different interpretations and perspectives on the National Party victory in 1948. Thanks ever so much for listening. I hope it's been useful for you.